Good morning, everyone. Today we are going to talk about analyzing isosceles triangles. We have already discussed isosceles triangles in general. We discussed them a few classes ago, just a little bit, but now we're going to get a little deeper into them. So let's review the parts of an isosceles triangle first. So at the top, we have our vertex angle. This angle is not equivalent to the other two angles in the triangle. At the bottom, we have our base and our base angles, which are congruent. And then we have our two legs on the side, and those legs are congruent. And those legs are opposite those base angles. Our base side, or our base leg, is not congruent to the other two legs. So you'll see that I marked those with different tick marks. Our isosceles triangle theorem says that if two sides of a triangle are congruent, then the angles opposite those sides are congruent. This theorem basically states that the base angles of an isosceles triangle are congruent. So if I'm looking at this picture here, I have sides AB and BC marked as congruent. So I can look opposite those and mark those angles also as congruent, meaning angle A would be congruent to angle C. I'm just checking to see I'm still recording because it crashed on me a little while ago. So now let's apply it to some problems down here. I have, in all three of these problems, I'm looking to find x. And I have that these two sides are congruent. So I can look across from them, look opposite, and mark those two angles as congruent. This one is labeled as 75, and those two angles are congruent. So I can also label this angle as 75. So this is an easy one. My x would be 75 degrees. Number 2 is amping it up a little bit. I have these two congruent sides. So opposite those sides, those angles must be congruent. The problem with this is that I don't have this one marked at all. Okay. However, I do know that all three angles in a triangle add to 180. So I can do 180 minus 40, which is that vertex angle up here. That means I have 140 degrees left to work with between these two angles. But these two angles should be congruent. So I have 140 degrees, and I should be cutting that in two because it should be equivalently going to both of these spaces. So I can divide by 2, and I get 70 degrees. So both of these angles should be even. They should be congruent, and they are 70 degrees. So now if I added these two and this angle together, I would get 180. All triangles have three angles adding to 180. So my x here is 70 degrees. Number 3 looks a lot like number 2, except they have expressions. So I can't just do 180 minus 2x. That's not really going to help me here because I don't even know what x is in this case. So I can mark my congruent angles based on these sides. So these two angles are my base angles. They're opposite those congruent sides. Since this angle is marked 6x plus 6, I can also mark this angle 6x plus 6 because they are congruent. And now I do know, as you just recall that I said, all three angles add to 180. So I can add all three of these expressions up and set them equal to 180. So I added this angle and the two base angles. Now I'm going to combine my like terms. So 2x, 6x, and 6x can combine to be 14x. And then I can combine 6 and 6 to get 12. I'm going to take away 12 from both sides. I get 14x equals 168. Then I'm going to divide by 14 on both sides to finish solving for my x. And I get that x is 12. And then you're going to flip your paper over, and we're going to start to talk about the converse of the isosceles triangle theorem. Now, this actual theorem really comes into play when we do proofs, but we're not doing those this year. So in a traditional year, we would be, but since this is a COVID year, we are skipping over proofs. So I wouldn't concern yourself too much with the actual theorem, but what it implies us to do mathematically down here is just as important as the front. So basically what the converse of the theorem says is basically opposite. So instead of saying if two sides of a triangle are congruent, then the angles are congruent, now we're saying if two angles of a triangle are congruent, then the sides opposite those angles are also congruent. So on the flip side, on the front side of the paper, we were being given angles. We were given sides, and we were trying to find the angles. Now we're going to be given sides, and we're trying to find. Now we're going to be given that angles are congruent, and we're trying to find the sides. So given this triangle here, it is isosceles. So I have these two angles marked both as 45. They're congruent. That means the sides opposite them must also be congruent. So that means that side BC must be congruent to side AC. So looking at this picture, if I look at these two angles that are marked, the sides opposite them should also be congruent. So if this side is marked 7, then this X must also be 7. Same thing with example 5, except now we have expressions. So these sides should be congruent. They're opposite those base angles. I'm just going to set those two expressions equal to each other. So I'm going to subtract 2x from both sides. I'm left with 6 equals x minus 6. And then I'm going to add 6 to both sides, and I finish with x equals 12. The next 4 checkpoint examples here are going to go over pretty much everything we just talked about. So if you are at home at this point, I want you to pause the video. I want you to try these 4 problems and then push play, and then you will watch me go over the problems. But I want you to take a minute to try these problems on your own. So right now, take a minute and push play and try 1 through 4. Okay, hopefully you have paused it and you are back now. So I'm going to go over numbers 1 through 4. I have these two sides congruent. So that means the angles opposite them must also be congruent. So if this is 54, this should also be 54. And this angle is x. I don't know x. I'm trying to find it. But I do know that all 3 angles in a triangle add to 180. So I'm going to take 54 and then another 54 away from 180. And I get 72. So that must be my x. That must be my last angle, because all 3 should add to 180. If I look at number 2, I have these 2 congruent angles. So this is that converse. The sides opposite them must be congruent then. So if this is 6, then x is 6. Number 3 here, I have these 2 sides congruent. I have my vertex angle up here is 3x, and these base angles have to be congruent. So if this is x, I'm going to label this angle S as x as well. Now those 3 angles should add to 180. So I can add those together, set them equal to 180, and solve. 3x, x, and x are all like terms. So these are essentially a 1 in front of them. So 3 plus 1 plus 1 is giving me 5x equals 180. I'll divide by 5 on both sides, and I get that x is 36. My last problem here, I have these 2 angles congruent. I'm going to look at the sides opposite them. Those must also be congruent. So I can set 2x equal to 3x minus 13. You can go about this problem 2 different ways. I am going to subtract 3x from both sides. I get negative x equals negative 13. I can't keep that x negative. So you can either divide by negative 1 on both sides or multiply. And then you'll be left with x equals positive 13. Okay, so today you guys are just working on the evens on the worksheet. If you are home, people in school would be doing the whole worksheet, but at home you are just doing the evens. And you are uploading that on Classroom for your classwork grade for today. Tomorrow, on Friday, we will be reviewing these notes. We'll also be reviewing the whole unit. Monday, you'll be reviewing the unit as well. And then next Thursday and Friday, you'll be taking your test on the unit. Okay? So if you have any questions, please feel free to come to office hours 1:05 to 1:55 today. Okay? Have a great Thursday, guys.